You're listening to Dead Strange, the podcast where I'll be delving into bizarre cases from across the globe. I'm your host, Sophie Ray. Before we start today's episode, here's a quick message from one of my favourite podcasts that I know you'll love as much as I do.
Well, hey there, I'm Melanie Peterson, the host of Mask of Sanity. Buckle up, my friends, and come on a journey with me as I take you through the cases of some of the world's most notorious killers and root for the brave men and women who brought them to justice. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and hear all about the calculated madness of some of the world's most brutal killers who hid behind the Mask of Sanity. Don't forget to follow Mask of Sanity on all social media to stay up to date on each week's episode. Until next time, stay safe, friends.
Thank you, and now on with the show. In this week's episode, I'll be talking about the murder of Lee Harvey, a case that shocked the United Kingdom. In the 1990s, Britain was alive with nightclub culture. Music artists such as Fatboy Slim and Haddaway made a living off producing iconic club anthems, adored by many outgoing partygoers. It was the May of 1994, and 25-year-old Tracie Andrews was one of these people, and she was spending the night clubbing at Ritzy's nightclub in Birmingham, England. It was here where she locked eyes with Lee Harvey, a local bus driver. The pair hit it off instantly and had a visible chemistry. Their mutual confident personalities and good looks made them a perfect couple, and they soon started a relationship together. After getting to know each other more, they soon learned they had something in common, and that was they were both single parents to young daughters, Carla and Danielle. The new couple would regularly take the two girls to the local park, and it was a good excuse to spend time with one another. Tracie was born in Birmingham on the 9th of April 1969. She lived with her parents and siblings at their family home, a modest terraced house in the town of Redditch. When she was about 6 years old, her parents had a particularly nasty divorce after a toxic relationship filled with jealousy and violence, which was said to have a lasting effect on young Tracie. As she grew up, she had dreams of becoming a model, but found herself working at a local pub as a barmaid. When she was 21, she found herself a single mother after her daughter's dad, Andy, left the scene, stating that Tracie was, quote, always hostile and angry over the smallest things, unquote. The pair were said to have an extremely toxic, controlling relationship and just couldn't settle their differences. In spite of this, they didn't let this interfere with their daughter's life, and though they shared a bitter hatred towards one another, they shared custody of little Carla, who was said to be a happy child. After a few weeks of dating and getting to know one another, Lee proudly introduced Tracie to his family, convinced she was the love of his life. Lee was extremely close to his family, and they described him as an outgoing and popular young man with a love for cars. The family trusted one another deeply and were inseparable. However, tensions rose when Lee's parents and his sisters said they didn't like Tracie one bit. In fact, they thought she was manipulative, self-obsessed, and completely controlling. They became concerned at her excessive jealousy and noticed that she hated Lee having any fun without her. When they confronted him over his blind obsession with his new lover, he abruptly left the family home and moved in with Tracie, and the pair took up residence in a flat in Alvechurch, Worcestershire. After settling in properly, the couple would regularly have their two daughters over to stay, and the two girls became extremely close. To the outside world looking in, it seemed that Lee and Tracie had finally recovered from their previous relationships and had found true love once again. Nothing seemed out of place in the relationship until Lee mentioned that he was still in close contact with his ex-girlfriend and Danielle's mother, Anita. Lee would have custody of Danielle every other weekend, and he still made an effort to remain acquaintances with Anita for the sake of their daughter. Of course, Tracie absolutely hated this. It seemed she wanted all Lee's attention for herself, and she'd frequently fly into jealous rages, accusing Lee of still being romantically invested in his ex-girlfriend. In retaliation, Lee often accused Tracie of having affairs, and huge arguments now dominated the couple's time together. Though Tracie never admitted to these affairs, her role as a barmaid was something that she loved, as it gave her ample opportunity to meet new men. And she even admitted she loved the attention she received from male punters. It was true that she'd often dress provocatively, and this began to make Lee extremely jealous and possessive, and a vicious cycle of rows would follow. Their relationship was now like a carbon copy of the one a young Tracie had witnessed between her own parents, with arguments breaking out at all hours of the day. The flat where Tracie and Lee lived wasn't exactly soundproof, and the whole block often complained about the constant sound of raised voices. After the worst fights, neighbours would witness Tracie throwing Lee's clothes out the window, and she'd kick him out. After these dramatic arguments, Lee would move back in with his family, who all supported him and begged him not to return to Tracie. Adamant in his decision, he'd vow never to return to his jealous lover again. However, as is typical with toxic relationships such as these, Lee would always eventually get back with Tracie, and each and every time they recoupled, they seemed stronger than ever. They showered each other with affection, and for a few weeks, they'd seem madly in love all over again. Although their closest friends and family could see their flaws, nobody could tell them otherwise, and after a 6-month whirlwind relationship, Lee proposed to Tracie, and she immediately said yes. If Lee imagined that the proposal would be some kind of solution to their taut relationship, he was greatly mistaken. The arguments carried on, and now the ever-jealous Tracie was beginning to get violent. In 1995, Lee's friends and family were shocked to discover a huge bite mark on his arm. When asked about it, he tried to play it off, but eventually admitted that during a particularly violent argument, his new fiancée sunk her teeth into him. Months later, this would happen again. This time, Tracie would bite Lee's neck. Things were now beginning to get serious, and everybody but Lee could see that Tracie had a dangerous temper. Lee's own sister even disowned him during this period, annoyed at his failure to see danger. It was the summer of 1996, and it seemed some good news had finally arrived. Tracie and Lee were delighted to find out they were expecting a baby, and many around them saw this as the blessing they needed to solidify their relationship. The announcement seemed to bring them closer together, and others around them noted that they seemed genuinely happy. Even Lee's family were excited at the prospect of a new arrival, putting their hatred toward Tracie aside. Throughout the summer of '96, the relationship seemed pretty stable. In August, Lee was at work doing his usual bus route around Birmingham when he received a frantic phone call from Tracie. She told him that he needed to come home immediately. Arriving back in a hurry, he found Tracie at the bottom of the stairs, in tears and clutching her stomach. She then broke the devastating news that she'd fallen and had a miscarriage. Completely in shock at this freak accident, the couple's family and friends rallied around them in their time of need. Following the trauma, the couple doted on one another, and even the neighbours were surprised at the lack of booming voices coming from the couple's flat. However, on the 25th of October, an argument erupted, and Tracie made the terrible confession that would sicken Lee Harvey and his family. She callously admitted that she had not lost the baby at all. Instead, she'd had an abortion because she simply didn't want Lee's child. Enraged at her selfishness, Lee flew into a blind rage and the violence from both of them began to escalate. If they thought the fights were bad before, they were nothing in comparison to the fights now. The police were called on several occasions and eventually the couple separated for a few weeks. Now living back at home, Lee was reportedly covered in bruises, scratches and bite marks, and Tracie looked in a similar state. Following all this, Lee's family begged him yet again that he needed to stay away from Tracie and leave the pointless relationship behind in the past. She clearly wasn't making him happy, as he'd noticed a distinctive change in his personality since the pair had met. Once fun-loving and sociable, Lee was now hesitant to spend any time with his friends in case Tracie got angry. Although Lee seemed to completely agree with his parents, it was not long before the couple reunited. They both shared the same toxic idea that neither could live without the other. It was now the 1st of December 1996, and although the couple was still fighting, nothing seemed to have escalated. Tracie was still making ends meet working as a barmaid, and Lee would spend the majority of the week driving Birmingham's buses. On that lazy Sunday morning, Tracie woke up early and got her daughter Carla ready for a photo shoot. The pair spent some quality mother-daughter time together as Carla's hair was brushed and styled, and she was dressed in fancy clothes, all ready for her big day in front of the camera. There was a good mood in the little Alv Church flat until Lee woke up and announced his plans for the day. He suggested that he might as well take his own daughter, Danielle, back to her mother's house earlier than expected. Unsurprisingly, Tracie became enraged and accused Lee of cheating on her. The atmosphere had now become tense, and there seemed to be a change of plan. Tracie refused to let Lee leave with his own daughter, and instead bundled the two girls into her car and drove off. She dropped Danielle back at her mother's, hesitant to let Lee have any contact with his ex. Now alone at the flat, Lee waited all day for Tracie and Carla to return, and he planned to make it up to her by taking her out to a local pub later that evening. When Tracie returned back at the flat, Lee apologised for changing plans so abruptly, and her foul mood soon went away when Lee said he wanted to spend quality time with her. The pair got ready and headed to the Malbrook pub, where they downed a few drinks. They left the pub at around 9:45 p.m. and began their usual route home, which is just a short drive along School Lane. With Lee at the wheel of his white 1990 Ford Escort, Tracie noticed that an old 1986 Ford Sierra was tailgating them. Telling her fiancé to ignore the tailgater, Tracie and Lee turned left onto Cooper's Hill, but the car was still following them. Given that this was late at night and along a dark, poorly lit road, the situation sounds utterly terrifying. Tracie's initial account of the event was that Lee pulled over and decided to confront the road rager. What started as a mere roadside argument resulted in a shocking murder. According to Tracie, there were two people in the Ford Sierra. She described the driver as a young man, around 18 years old, with short black hair. When Lee got out the car, so did he, and the two got into a heated argument. Tracie pleaded with her fiancé to return to the car, saying that she sensed immediate danger. The passenger, described by Tracie as a, quote, fat man with staring eyes, unquote, then got out and approached Tracie, who was still sitting in the passenger seat. Sensing his aggression, she got out to defend herself and her fiancé. At this point, the man bellowed an onslaught of abuse at Tracie and knocked her unconscious to the ground, resulting in two black eyes. When she recovered and pulled herself up out of the dirt, she looked over to Lee, and saw he was being punched and kicked by the passenger. The driver and passenger then jumped back in their car and fled the scene. Tracie ran over to Lee, who was barely conscious at the roadside. Horrified, she realised that Lee was covered with blood and was seriously injured. She tried to save him but was soon overcome with panic and instead screamed out in grief when she realised he was barely breathing. Startled by the screams, a man from a nearby cottage ran out to the road to see what all the commotion was about. He found Tracie utterly hysterical next to Lee's lifeless body, and the police were called at around 10:45 p.m, about an hour after the couple had left the pub. When the emergency services arrived, Lee was pronounced dead at the scene. He had suffered 42 stab wounds to his chest, neck and back. Whoever had stabbed him must have done so with an immense amount of rage, as the stab wounds were deep and each one was in close proximity to the next, meaning the attack had been extremely frenzied. The palms of his hands were covered with cuts, meaning that he'd tried desperately to defend himself. The cause of death was confirmed as being a severed carotid artery, and a huge stab wound to Lee's neck was the obvious culprit. Tracie didn't have many serious injuries, but she was covered in blood and in a state of shock. She was taken to Alexandra Hospital in Redditch, where she was treated for her bruising and severe emotional trauma. Once a glamorous, aspiring model, Tracie now looked haggard and bruised. At 3:20 a.m, Lee's family was sound asleep when they got a knock at the door. The sight of police officers on your doorstep at the early hours of the morning is bound to be a gut-wrenching experience, and for Maureen and Roy Harvey, the words uttered by those officers were almost too shocking to comprehend. They were told the devastating news that their son had been murdered in a road rage attack, and his killer was still out there. In utter disbelief, it was difficult to understand that their lovable, friendly son was never coming home for Christmas. At this point, Tracie was still recovering in hospital, and she seemed oblivious to the fact that Lee had passed away at all. In fact, she'd repeatedly asked if he was okay, and thought nurses were lying to her when they delivered the sad news that he'd been discovered dead at the scene. The crime shook the nation, and police were determined to catch the road rage killer as quickly as they could. When investigating officers returned to the hospital to question Tracie, they had every bit of sympathy for the woman with 2 black eyes and the traumatised, vacant stare of someone who'd just lost the love of their life. They tried to get every detail from her so they could bring her fiancé's killer to justice, but expected it would be difficult given her state of shock. In spite of her ordeal, she remembered a ton of specific details, from the overweight passenger wearing a donkey jacket to the cocky young driver who'd started the road rage incident in the first place. She kept repeating the phrase, quote, "I told him not to get out of the car," unquote, through tears whilst rocking back and forth, and her trauma was truly shocking to witness. Throughout questioning, Tracie would constantly excuse herself to the toilet, and officers considered her grief and were more than lenient with her, letting her go alone. Nobody thought it was suspicious at all. After all, she was grieving, and police thought she'd maybe benefit from some time alone. Given the fact that she'd given such accurate descriptions of the 2 men, investigators had a good chance of finding them. After declaring the area of Cooper's Hill a major crime scene, they began to comb through the roads looking for any evidence that could link them to the suspects. There was no dumped murder weapon hidden in the ditches of the road, nor were there any discarded bloody clothes. The only shred of physical evidence they found was a black woolen hat, and Tracie suddenly remembered that one of the men was wearing that exact beanie. Forensics were performed on the beanie, but no DNA was found except for a few cat hairs. It seemed they were at a dead end. Accompanied by Lee's grieving family and Tracie, police officers questioned the staff at Malbrook pub, who confirmed that the couple left around 9:45 p.m, just as Tracie had said. As they were all trying to establish an accurate timeline, Lee's family were taken aback by several odd statements made by Tracie. She claimed that Lee had been travelling at around 70 miles per hour when he turned onto Cooper's Hill, a road that was dimly lit and with lots of bends. An experienced driver like Lee, especially somebody used to driving buses, would certainly know that driving at such an excessive speed would be dangerous. They also thought it was odd that Lee would pull over on a dark country road, something that's pretty risky to do in poor visibility. Even though they had their suspicions, they believed Tracie's story, and they all supported one another. After all, she now seemed much more like a frightened mouse, rather than the violent woman they'd known in recent months. With police now struggling to find Lee's killer, they suggested to Tracie that she should do a public appeal, and a press conference was arranged the very next day. The public was shocked that a grieving witness to such an atrocious crime could appear on TV so quickly. Nevertheless, thousands tuned in to watch as Tracie Andrews, bruised and tearful, took to the panel to plead for her fiancé's killer to come forward. When questioned about the events leading up to Lee's murder, Tracie turned to the camera and stated that, quote, "Both Lee and the other person had been playing cat and mouse with each other for a while. I got out the car because I'm not the type of person to just sit there. I went over to the man and he hit me. I don't know if I was knocked out for a while or not," unquote. She then began to describe her fiancé's killer and begged anybody to come forward with any information. The police officers sitting next to her on the panel were shocked when Tracie appealed directly to the driver of the car, who she claimed had nothing to do with the murder. She said, quote, "The driver walked off, it was nothing to do with him. All I want is for you to come forward because you are not to blame for this, and I know that. Just come forward and you won't get into any trouble," unquote. Of course, this was completely untrue, as investigators and Tracie knew that the driver would still be charged for his connection to the murder. People were now beginning to get suspicious of Tracie, and she was heavily scrutinised by the press. It was at this point of the interview when Tracie made a bizarre facial expression, one that warranted many camera flashes and speculation. Tracie is glaring toward the cameras and sticking her jaw out in a garish manner. And it turns out her crazed expression reflected who she truly was inside. It turns out that Tracie Andrews was a vicious killer who had murdered her fiancé and lied to the nation. It was now a few hours after the press conference, and Tracie decided she would drive back to the flat, telling her family that she wanted to be alone. In the meantime, Tracie's mother was looking after little Carla, who was still too young to understand what had happened. She was playing with her mum's handbag when she found a note addressed to her inside it. Horrified, Tracie's mum realised it was a suicide note, with Tracie saying one last goodbye to her daughter and saying that she wanted to be with Lee. She raced to the flat where Tracie was found unconscious after taking a huge overdose of pills. An ambulance took her back to the same hospital she had found herself in on the night of the fateful murder, and now the fight was on to save Tracie's life. Police officers saw this as an admission of guilt and took Tracie's hospitalisation as an opportunity to gather evidence. They were now abandoning the search for the mystery overweight man with wild staring eyes, and were instead focusing on Tracie herself, who they'd once seen as an innocent victim. Something didn't quite add up in the time frame of the murder, so investigating officers took a drive to the Malbrook pub, where the couple had shared their last drink together. They measured how long it would take them to arrive at Cooper's Hill. It took a mere 10 minutes, which left the question: why did it take over an hour for the crime to be reported? A few days after Tracie's appeal, a credible witness approached investigators with an interesting take on the situation. She was a young woman who lived nearby to the scene in one of the many cottages that surrounded the country lane of Cooper's Hill. In her version of events, on the night it happened, she was disturbed by raised voices, which she thought of as unusual on such a quiet road. When asked if she'd heard the voices of 3 men and a woman, she was adamant she'd only heard 1 man and 1 woman. This seemed strange, seeing as though Tracie Andrews had said she and Lee had argued with the 2 men for several minutes. Another man came forward with even better information and told investigators that he'd actually seen Lee and Tracie's car travelling toward Cooper's Hill, and was certain no car was pursuing them. The witness remembered that he'd seen Lee's car travelling along the road, reversed, and then made the turn onto Cooper's Hill. After that, the witness heard an intense argument between a couple, then screaming, before hearing complete silence. After receiving these credible witness statements, the police immediately went to Alexandra Hospital, where they apprehended Tracie. The date was December the 7th, and Tracie was still feeling pretty unwell from her suicide attempt. However, police wasted no time and took her into custody for questioning over the murder, much to the shock of the nation. Once seen as a traumatised witness to a callous crime, Tracie was now seen as a deranged killer, driven by jealousy. In a stark contrast to her press conference, Tracie had suddenly gone very quiet and refused to talk to the police unless talking to her solicitor first. When her solicitor arrived and the questioning could begin, Tracie still remained extremely quiet. When police let her know they didn't believe her made-up story, she became angry and did her best to convince them she was telling the truth. They saw through her fake tears instantly, and now the whole country had turned on the woman they once deeply empathised with. After weeks of dramatic newspaper headlines, a 10-day murder trial was set for the 14th of July 1997 at Birmingham Crown Court. The investigating officers began to relay their evidence on the second day of the trial, and their witness statements proved crucial in putting Tracie behind bars. Both witnesses made it clear, and a clear timeline of the murder was more or less established. It started out with Tracie starting an argument with Lee shortly after they left the pub. After this, she ordered him to drop her off at Cooper's Hill so she could walk home alone. After she got out the vehicle, Lee ordered her to get back in, and a huge row started at the roadside. Adamant she was walking home alone, Lee gave up, turned around and walked back to the car. This is when Tracie suddenly produced a penknife and stabbed him in the back. She continued the vicious attack, stabbing her fiancé over 30 times in his chest and neck, resulting in his death. A bloodstain pattern analyst reported that the bloodstains found on Tracie's New Look sweatshirt were indicative of her being close to Lee when he was supposedly attacked. The signature sprayed pattern of the blood was the same kind of pattern you'd find at an especially violent murder scene, and the evidence was presented at her trial. It now seemed pretty obvious to the jury that she'd killed her fiancé in a jealous rage. One thing that convinced the jury even more was when prosecutor David Krigman presented Tracie's black snakeskin boot. On the inside, there was a signature indentation in the shape of a knife. It was established that Tracie had hidden the knife inside her designer shoe and then flushed it down the hospital toilet. This explained her constant need to excuse herself while she was supposed to be recovering from her state of shock. When Tracie finally took to the stand, she came across as shy and nervous, and repeatedly claimed that she couldn't remember anything at all. The courtroom didn't buy her story, and the prosecution team began to pick her far-fetched tale apart. They questioned her as to why she had taken so long to phone for police or shout for help, and why she hadn't ran to one of the nearby cottages. With each question, Tracie grew more annoyed and was unable to produce logical explanations. Now, she certainly didn't look like the quiet, grieving woman who had took to the stand moments ago. As the jury looked upon her furious face, they knew she was guilty as sin. She was sentenced to life imprisonment on July 29th, 1997. It would take Tracie almost 2 years to finally confess to murdering her fiancé. In her version of events, Lee had been the one to start the argument. She stated that he became angry and aggressive, and he pulled over and kicked her out the car, threatening her with a knife. She somehow managed to get the knife off him and stabbed him over 40 times in self-defense. Whether or not there's any truth in Tracie's tale is unclear, but you don't stab your fiancé multiple times in self-defense, nor do you wait at the roadside for an hour pondering what to do, nor do you conceal the knife in your boot and flush it down a hospital toilet. Tracie also admitted planting the black woolly hat at the crime scene, a hat she had stolen from her mother's house. In prison, Tracie remained remorseless. She rarely talked about Lee's murder, and when she did, she told fellow inmates that she, quote, wouldn't cry over spilt milk, unquote. Sadly, the lenient English justice system meant that Tracie only served 15 years of her life sentence. After being released from prison in July 2011, Tracie continued her life as if nothing had ever happened. She got plastic surgery free on the National Health Service, dyed her hair, and changed her name twice. She remarried a divorced security guard who was not put off by her murderous past, and the couple are regularly photographed out and about on shopping sprees in the city of York. A lack of remorse is truly scary, and thankfully she is banned from coming anywhere near Lee's grieving family. Though once ripped apart by the shocking crime, Lee's daughter Danielle and Tracie's daughter Carla have since rekindled their relationship. Danielle recalls finding Carla through Facebook, where she apologised for her mum's crimes, even though it wasn't her fault. Despite the awkward situation between them, the pair remembered the good times they shared together as little girls, and feel safe in knowing that Tracie Andrews will never enter their lives again. That's it for this week's episode of Dead Strange. I'd just like to thank each and every one of you for helping me hit over 180 downloads. Please know that I am eternally grateful for your support. Also, be sure to follow Dead Strange Pod across all social media platforms for any updates. I have been your host, Sophie Ray. Bye for now.